So welcome, welcome. We're so glad that you're here with us this evening. My name is Cynthia Cutting and I'm the director here at the Museum of the White Mountains. And so very proud to be presenting tonight's event. The museum's Mountain Voices program has been going really well and through this year. And it's kind of a thank you to COVID that made us do this in this particular format. But the wonderful thing is we're expanding the people who can engage because you can find us from all over the map as long as you can make the timing work. So we're really glad, really glad you're here with us this evening. And before I say anything else, I'd like to thank our members of the museum who make programs like this possible through their support. And we have had a wonderful group of members who have had our backs this entire year and have made it so that we can innovate, we can hire students to do research. We have a new student videographer, we have a graphic designer, we have all these great things that we can continue to do because of our members' care about the museum, even if they can't come in the building. So thank you to those members who are here with us this evening. And if you're not a member yet, you're certainly welcome to join us and hear quickly about programs like this, which will continue. I'm going to give you a sneak peek piece of news, which is we will be reopening this summer we're very excited, and we'll be reopening with a wonderful exhibit called Wayfinding Maps of the White Mountains, a little bit apropos for this evening. That exhibition has been co-curated by Adam Apt and David Gavatsky, who are two of our wonderful advisors at the museum and wonderful collectors of maps. So we're very excited, and we'll be presenting the speaker series for that exhibition, which is funded by New Hampshire Humanities. We'll be presenting that in a kind of hybrid, online and in person. And so you too can be joining us for those. So watch for those events coming this summer. And I do want to thank our advisors because our chair of our advisory council is right dead center in my screen. So Becky Moore, who is here with us this evening. Thank you, Becky, for being here. And we're just so grateful to our advisors who help us guide us through steps that we can take to engage people and innovate interesting exhibitions. So thank you. So excited, and it seems strangely apropos to have this program this evening. Very excited that tonight's event will blend art, hiking, storytelling, and weather. It's so wonderful to be welcoming Laurie Whitehill. She is Zooming to us from California this evening, but she is no stranger to our White Mountain region, as many of you know. Laurie was the Special Collections Librarian and Curator of Artist Books at the Rhode Island School of Design. She has an BFA in illustration from RISD and a master's in library science from the University of Rhode Island. What I love about Laurie is she combines so many of the issues that and the ideas that the museum is so interested in, the idea of environment and writing and response to nature and art in her work. And we're so very glad that she's here with us this evening. Laurie, welcome, and thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you so much. So bear with me as I transition to my my keynote.
Oh, and I should say, just as you're getting started, go ahead doing that. As we go through the program, if you have questions, you're welcome to put them in the chat. And at the end of the program, Rebecca, my cohort here, will be curating those questions and posing them to Laurie so that we can answer them. So don't forget to add your 2 cents.
Okay, great. Okay, here goes. I'm not seeing my screen.
Okay, so
do
you have your
oh wait
on your screen?
Not up yet.
Okay, put that up first.
Okay, but then I can't get back to share. There we go. Okay,
there you go.
Hey, it works. All right. Here we go. And
Yeah.
I'm going to move this over a little bit because it's in my way. Okay. All right. Well, I just want to add my welcome to everyone too. And thank you so much for joining me. I'm really excited to see all of you here. And I do want to thank Cynthia and Rebecca at the Museum of the White Mountains for giving me this generous opportunity to share my story with you. So for a bit of personal background, I spent almost a third of my life vacationing or living and raising a family in New Hampshire. And these beautiful mountains still feel like home to me and my family, as you'll soon see why. I've entitled my presentation Snowbound Revisited, An Adventure in the Mountains and the Studio. At a young age, during our summers spent in New Hampshire, my father would often take us hiking in the White Mountains. He told of climbing them as a boy, skiing some of them in college, and how much they were a part of our family's history. Over the years, I came to know these mountains intimately, like the back of my hand. Our combined memories of hiking, spanning 3 generations, became the inspiration behind my handmade artist book. An adventure that unfolded in 1915 led to an adventure of a different sort during my sabbatical year, 2012. The story for my book is about my grandparents, Robert and Lucia Whitehill. They and a few other hikers in September 1915 were stranded for 5 days in the newly built Lakes of the Clouds hut below Mount Washington's summit. Most of my reimagining of their story is adapted from my grandfather's written account, published in the June 1917 issue of Appalachia. My own copy of this magazine is crumbling from many years of rereading, and Robert's article is written with a genteel sense of masculine adventure, and the language is charmingly polite. I also gleaned a lot from reading my grandfather's pocket-sized 1916 copy of Guide to Paths in the White Mountains. Within its worn covers, I found old trail maps, handwritten notes, and a tiny pressed alpine bluet. There was so much I wanted to learn about the times in which my grandparents lived, so research was essential. In addition to various general historical references in my own library, I visited the archive and library of the Appalachian Mountain Club, or AMC, in Boston. With the help of librarian Becky Fullerton, we looked at old hiking guides, maps, and hiking diaries, especially those written by women. She even found my grandfather's AMC membership registration card, which was so cool to see. In these collections, there were several old images of Mount Washington. On the left is a view of its summit in the Lakes of the Clouds, seen from the top of nearby Mount Monroe. There's no hut yet in that photo. On the right is a later view of the lakes and the hut and Mount Monroe beyond, seen from Washington's summit. You can see how wild and barren these mountains are. Uh-oh. Here are early photographs of the stone hut when it was first built. And notice how exposed this structure is, situated well above tree line. Here's an early photograph of the hut interior. The bunks were metal with possibly 3 tiers on 2 sides, which folded up when not in use. There was a small coal-burning stove for heat, a table with benches, and storage shelves for food supplies. There were separate bunk rooms for men and women. On the right is an architect's drawing for the Carter Notch hut, after which the Lakes hut was modeled, but without the sheltered porch. On the left is an early view of a section of the 8-mile carriage road, now the auto road, which led from the stage office in Pinkham Notch to the summit of Washington. On the right is a memorial on the trail near the Lakes hut, reminding hikers of the potential dangers of hiking on these mountains. Below is a page from a female hiker's diary describing beautiful views and the heavy gusts of wind blowing in spirals around the summit. One of the members of the stranded group had brought a camera with him. I'm thinking it was probably a wooden box camera, and it captured images onto glass plates. Evidently, he was able to take this photo of the frost-covered hut during a brief lull in the storm. I was familiar with some of these photos that were included in my grandfather's published account, but in the AMC archive, I discovered more glass lantern slide images from that adventure. One was a picture of the whole group of survivors, including my grandparents. I don't know why it had never occurred to me that my grandmother would have hiked Mount Washington back in those days in a long skirt, but there she is. Inspired by that blotchy photo of my grandmother, curiosity led me to research what women hikers might have worn in the early decades of the 20th century. What was it like to be encumbered in bulky, confining clothing on such challenging mountainous terrain? I learned from hiking diaries that women might wear 2 layers of skirt. The underskirt could be about knee length. The longer boot-length outer skirt could be pulled up and pinned to the waist for more freedom when needed. At the end of the hike, the long skirt could easily be restored to a more modest length. Some women hikers even stored their lunch in the rolled-up skirt. From a 1914 issue of Vanity Fair and from a 1920 Montgomery Ward catalog, I found examples of women's winter athletic clothes and women's undergarments, camisoles, long johns, and corsets. I knew then that I definitely had to reimagine this story from my grandmother's perspective. Here are my grandparents posed in a family portrait 2.5 years after their hiking adventure. That's my father, the baby, sitting on Lucia's lap. On the right is a picture of Lucia, more like my early memories of her, loud and full of life. Here's Lucia in the center with my grandfather several years later. It looks like knickers were more common by then and the skirts were out. Now for my reimagined version of their story. These images show my book format and page layouts adapted from my grandfather's hiking guide. I wanted the reader to imagine my book easily fitting in a backpack or pocket. On the left is the outside cover. It's kind of hard to tell from the photo, but there is a back flap that folds and tucks into the front cover to keep maps and notes from falling out. On the right is a sample text page. On the top of each page, under headings for trails and other mountain highlights, in regular type, are revised snippets of Robert's gentlemanly voice. My musings, questions, and reimaginings spoken to Lucia are in italic type below, separated by a snowflake ornament. Visually, you would be able to determine the 2 voices, the separate voices on each page, so I will try to make them obvious as I read the story aloud. So this is how it all begins. Snowbound in September, a reimagining. Mortals wander, but mountains are as old friends. On September 25th, 1915, my grandparents, Robert and Lucia Whitehill, accompanied by 2 friends, began a 3-day recreational hike on several of the highest peaks of the White Mountains in New Hampshire. From Robert's detailed written account, theirs was an ambitious plan. Day 1. Climb nearly 4 miles to the 6,288-foot summit of Mount Washington via Tuckerman's Ravine. From the summit, hike down another 1.75 miles on the other side to spend the first night in the Lakes of the Clouds hut, located on the mountain's shoulder at 5,012 feet. Day 2, traverse the summits of several peaks above tree line, a distance of over 6 miles, and arrive at the Madison Spring hut to spend the second night. Day 3, hike down from Mount Madison to the Glen House in Pinkham Notch, from there to be picked up and motored back to their 2 young sons, waiting with friends in nearby Jackson. Day 1. 4 happy trampers with knapsacks shouldered, we step out on a pleasant morn in the early fall. The sky is clear and the air crisp. Our hearts are restless for nature's wild beauty. 96 years later, I reflect on your thoughts, Lucia. I admire your spirit and imagine your excitement to be out of doors, free from humdrum household routines. Tuckerman Ravine Path. Into the forest, the trail leads up a fairly steep grade with the most delightful streams crossing the path. We take a little rest. The water grows cooler at each stopping place. At the base of Tuckerman's Ravine, frowning ramparts tower steeply on three sides, yet we continue climbing with excited anticipation. Reaching the top of the ravine's head wall, we are no longer sheltered. Scrambling against a terrific wind, we labor up the open, rocky summit cone of Mount Washington, searching for white painted trail markers or piled rock cairns. Old photographs show you as a tall, stocky, barrel-shaped woman, yet Robert tells of you climbing impatiently ahead of the rest with youthful eagerness. Summit House. No sooner at the summit, we turn and beat a hasty retreat as the wind strikes with fury. Crawford Bridle Path. Bracing against the gusts, we jump from rock to rock down the other side of Mount Washington's summit cone, struggling to stay on our feet. Along the way, we pass wooden crosses marking earlier mountain tragedies. At last, we arrive at the stone hut, a welcome sight. It sits perched above tree line in the rocky alpine meadow beside two small glacial lakes. About the same time, we encounter two other travelers who have come up the bridle path from Crawford Notch. Now we are 6 weary trampers, joining the hut keeper, sheltered inside for the night. What was your response to the hut, described in the local papers as a crystal palace for a crystal height? With 8-foot square picture windows, its limitless views of the capering elements must have been glorious. Lakes of the Clouds hut. Sunset is radiant, but daylight does not linger. The wind roars, rushing up the mountain all night long. Built by the Appalachian Mountain Club in the summer of 1915, this structure hugs the exposed ridge and is designed to repel the tempestuous onslaughts of mountain gales. It is equipped with blankets and bunks for 24 men in the main room and 12 women in the smaller room, and offers meals for a modest fee. You are among the first visitors, as it has been open for less than a month the day you arrive. Day 2. Early morning clouds scud low and thick, and rain soon beats against the windows of the hut. We are forced to sit tight for a while indoors, postponing our hiking plans. Clouds part suddenly. We joyfully escape out of doors, racing up nearby Mount Monroe, but on the summit, no one is able to safely stand. Turning, everyone scrambles back to the hut, not a minute too soon, safely housed again. Now the real storm begins. I imagine you, restless, always eager to be doing something. You must have been relieved to get outside again. Robert describes you as thankful for your embonpoint, a delicate way of saying that your generous size is sufficient to keep you from going skyward. The huge windows are a splendid target for the storm's full fury. We listen anxiously to ominous crashes and buffetings throughout the rest of the day and night. Temperatures drop greatly. The stone structure vibrates. The windows bulge, but hold. Later, you learn that during this hurricane on the summit of Mount Washington, winds were tracked at 175 miles per hour. Day or night, icy windows. Under layers of heavy blankets with frosty breath, we pace miles between the bunks. No one is too warm, little sleep. Even with an ample supply of coal for the stove, Robert notes that daytime temperatures reach no higher than 38 degrees. To conserve heat, you close off the women's bunk room and use all 85 of the hut blankets. During the day, you huddle around the small stove or stay in bed. Day 3. As the day of our planned meeting at Glen House passes, gloom settles in. some of us thinking about families, anxious far below. Glimpses through icy panes show rocks thick with snow and frost feathers. To attempt escape now would mean certain death. These mountainous heaps are no longer friends. You learn that the wireless telegraph has been recently dismantled for this season. I wonder if this reminds you of a similar human error on the Titanic. Though Robert doesn't dwell on it, you must talk about your sons with concern for their worry. Were you praying? Two of the hardier men managed to crawl to the stream for water, buckets attached to their bodies with rope. What water they gather is quickly sucked out by wind, drenching them on the way. The larder is scantily stocked, and the food supply causes serious thought of the future should the storm continue. Hunger is barely relieved by a few old potatoes and a peculiar but edible kind of bread made clumsily from flour and eaten with spoonfuls of melted leftover bacon fat. I live with your stained handwritten recipe book filled with entries for casseroles, breads, and desserts. For a celebrated cook, accustomed as you were to providing generous meals for your growing boys, this situation must have been especially stark. Trapped on the mountain day after day while the storm rages, the constant roar of the wind wears on nerves. I have researched the times in which you lived, Lucia. During the long hours of captivity to keep your minds off the storm, I wonder what you talked about. Were you debating the possibility of the US involvement in the war across the Atlantic since the recent sinking of the Lusitania? You both were avid readers and thinkers. Perhaps you shared thoughts about the latest writings of Bertrand Russell or Sigmund Freud, or discussed Joyce's Dubliners or Burroughs' Tarzan of the Apes. Day 4. Cold seeps into our bones in a paralyzing fashion. Forming a ring, we manage to march slowly around, slapping the shoulders of our neighbor in front. Was your mind numb from the howling of the wind, hunger, and the effort to stay warm? Or did gloom sometimes give way to gaiety? I wonder if you talked about Charlie Chaplin movies, the latest jazz tune, or maybe even sang It's a Long Way to Tipperary as you marched in a ring. The days seem so long and our uneasiness grows rampant. We discuss possible plans, should the wind abate, and the ladies busy themselves in cutting remnants of an old blanket into strips to wrap around our legs as puttees. When the wind lulls a bit, they even sally out a few rods to see whether travel in the storm might be possible. In an instant, they are lost in thick clouds. Only the cowbell ringing violently signals them safely back. They confessed afterward to have been hopelessly lost, just a stone's throw away. I wonder if this is how my parents came to use a cowbell to call us home from playing in the neighborhood. How we hated that cowbell and felt embarrassed in front of our friends, never imagining it was once a lifeline for you. Day 5. We are awakened with a shout. The wind has ceased, the sky is clear, and the heavens overhead are a fleckless dome. Ignoring the cold, we all run outside. Around and above the lakes of the clouds, the great cone of Mount Washington's summit is spotless white, resembling a huge frosted cake. The walls of the stone hut are covered with fairy-like frost feathers. Foot-thick icy plumes in myriad patterns also coat rocks and boulders all around. The sun rises with a roseate glow. Views far and wide are breathtakingly clear. Above tree line, it is winter, but the autumn valleys below are glorious but trampled green and gold. It is time to escape. Were you jumping around with joy, eager for everyone to get going? Did you join the chorus of oohs and ahs, which I imagine could be heard a mile away in the clear air? Crawford Bridle Path. Our plan is to climb back up the cone of Mount Washington's summit and from there walk down the carriage road to Glen House. We decide to leave a note on the door of the hut listing each in our party and the route we have taken. How unfortunate that the Ammonoosuc Ravine Trail, which now leads hikers directly down the mountain from the hut, was incomplete in 1915. It would have provided you with a shorter and safer descent. In a fuzzy, scratched glass lantern slide found in the AMC archives, for the first time I see you up close. My heart stops and tears gather, for there you are, full of life, posing in front of the frost-covered hut. You are wearing a long skirt. Were you wearing a corset too? 1,000 more questions flood my mind. Feet cold from wading in drifts, we plod on, the once familiar landmarks of the trail now difficult to find in the altered snowscape. Summit House. At the top of Mount Washington, we flash mirrors, signaling news of safety to our anxious friends in Jackson. From down in the valley, on either side, there are multiple answering flashes. Was one of those answering flashes from your 8-year-old son, hoping against hope that you both survived? 2.5 years later, in 1918, you gave birth to your third son, my father. How things could have turned out differently. The carriage road. From the summit, we still have a long way to go, but words cannot express our happiness in that descent. For most of the day, we slog through the snow, down the 8-mile carriage road, stopping to rest several times, one of them for another photograph. In all the years I've had that grainy black and white photograph of the hikers posing on the carriage road, I was never sure which of those tiny figures in the snow might be yours. Now at last I know. You stand tall and strong, feet firmly planted in a manly stance. Your long skirt hem is tucked into your waist in a no-nonsense fashion, revealing knickered legs with calves carefully wrapped in blankets. The halfway house. We are met by a rescue party coming up the carriage road near the halfway house, and though our feet are cold, our hearts are warm enough to make up for it. At last we arrive at the bottom of the mountain. Our frozen bare feet are thawed in a shovel of snow at the stage office. Though hungry, cold, and exhausted from your ordeal, what relief and joy you must have felt when you were finally reunited with your boys. In the years to come, on cold, wintry nights while safe and snug at home, would they often ask you to retell your snowbound story? Wandering mortals, saved by unseen grace, mountains and trampers are again as old friends. Lucia, how I wish I had asked you more questions while you were still alive, before the stroke took your boisterous voice and boundless energy. I wish you had lived long enough for me to tell you my own tramping stories of the many hikes I shared with family and friends in the White Mountains. Imagine the laughter if we could compare tales of our hiking gear. Know that your love of hiking and adventure endures. The passion you and Robert shared with my father also lives in me, and these mountains are old friends, even to your great-grandchildren. The first thing I did was make a model for the binding structure of my book based on Robert's hiking guide. Throughout the year, I used this sketchbook to visually document my sabbatical. I had already begun writing several versions of the story the year before my sabbatical started. After a lot of research and rereading of Robert's account, my approach to telling their story from a woman's perspective evolved. Then, using InDesign software, I rewrote and formatted numerous text versions and page layouts over and over. I ended up with 18 different text versions and 12 different layout mock-ups. How does any artist or writer know when the work is really done? Working mostly from photographs, I started drawing the illustrations because I wanted each image to be printed in 2 or 3 colors. Each color layer, from light to dark, had to be drawn separately. I decided to print these illustrations as linocuts. Plates consist of a layer of linoleum adhered to a base block. The negative space of the image is carved out of the linoleum layer, and the remaining raised surface of the linoleum is what gets printed. If you've ever done a potato print, you know how that works. For my illustrations, each of the 2 or 3 color layers required a separate carved block. Here you see more of my drawings and the process of carving blocks. I experimented with different color possibilities and made lots of hand-pulled test prints in my studio. Here you see an early test print of the 2 layers for the hemlock image. After several months, the test prints were finally done and all 38 blocks were carved and ready for printing. In the process of designing and redesigning those 15 illustrations, almost as many carved blocks ended up as rejects. I learned not to fear the do-over. Next, I rented the use of a Vandercook No. 4 proof press in the studio of a colleague and began the printing process. Layouts for printing had to be calculated and measured in advance, as each sheet of paper would eventually be printed on both sides, then cut and folded. 1 linoleum block at a time was precisely placed and locked up on the press bed so that each printed layer would line up over the previous layer. Here you see the 2 hemlock blocks and the resulting print, first one color, then the 2 together. Day after day, the printing was challenging and sometimes seemed endless, but it was so exciting to see the images take shape and the prints stack up. Here you can see the result of printing the 3rd color on top of the previous 2. That 3rd color always added detail and made the images pop. I sent my formatted digital files to a company that reproduces them as photopolymer plates. I would never have been able to find enough lead type to set it all by hand, so this was a wonderful alternative. These plates were adhered type high to the press bed and inked and printed just like the linoleum blocks. The text plates had to be registered to line up precisely with the already 2-sided printed sheets of images. Most often, a single sheet of paper would have gone through the press for printing images and text a total of 8 times. To be sure I had enough good, usable printed pages for 25 book copies, I printed 40 or more copies of each sheet. That's a lot of printing and a lot of cleaning the inky rollers. After almost 3 months of printing, and some full sheets I actually printed all over again, the final images, text, and map were done. Back in my studio, I began to work on cutting the sheets, trimming, folding, and collating the pages for each of the 25 copies. Sewing signatures, gluing spines, and constructing the complex covers at times seem monotonous and never-ending. There's also a kind of meditative aspect to repetitive handwork where precision and focus are key. The world outside simply disappears. The final test of my craft came at the point of gluing the text blocks into the book covers. Because glue could easily get everywhere and ruin all the work I'd done, everything had to be kept clean and well organized, a real challenge at times. Once covered, each bound copy was slipped in the book press for a neat squeeze. When the books were stable and dry, I numbered and signed each one. Those were moments of intense relief, as well as deep gratitude for having had the opportunity to experience such an amazing adventure. Copies of my book went first to family, and the remaining copies now reside in the collections of libraries around the country. One copy I personally presented to Becky Fullerton in the AMC Librarian archive, as you see there. And thanks to Becky Moore, a copy resides in the collection of the Museum of the White Mountains. Whatever the reason, I imagine that for many of you, the mountains truly draw you to them. It's certainly like that in my family. Although my studio adventure lasted longer than the ordeal of my grandparents, mine was never dangerous or life-threatening. Yet still, our adventures share some similarities. We started out with excitement, trepidation, and energy. We encountered unanticipated obstacles to our plans and had to regroup. We got creative at solving problems. We endured long days and nights of endless effort and uncertainty. We had seen and unseen help in our most troubling moments. We weren't ever sure if we were going to make it. At the end of our adventures, we had a new awareness of previously untapped physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual strengths we could not have imagined possible. Our hardest challenges eventually became blessings, and we gained a story that would touch and inspire our family for generations to come.
We should do the little hands up. Oh, thank you.
Here's the book.
There's the book.
Yeah.
Thank you, Laura. What a wonderful presentation. I love that you included all those photographs of your process and in making the book.
Thank you.
So interesting.
Yeah.
So
Well,
I'm sure
it
there's
was an adventure for sure.
It sounds like it.
Yeah,
Did you ever imagine, did you have a complete idea from the beginning, or did this kind of evolve as an idea?
The idea for the content, I had that for a long time, but the idea of what kind of perspective to take in telling the story, how to make it my story too, that took a little while, and it wasn't until I saw that picture of Lucia, and that just like, okay, it has to be told from imagining what it was like for her, because in those days, women didn't get to voice their thoughts as much. But also there were so many things that I needed to learn in terms of process. And so it was a huge learning experience. I did have a lot of experience, but there were so many new things I had to learn too.
Rebecca, do you have some questions?
Sure. So wonderful talk, Laurie. It was great.
Thank you.
And our first question is, what are the dimensions of the book?
Oh gosh. It's this big. Okay, I think it's something like 7 or 5, maybe 6 or 6 inches by like 3.5 inches, something like that. Smaller than a paperback book. It could fit in a big pocket of a jacket or easily in a backpack. And it's that thick. And the pages fold out like that. At least the illustrations fold out. Yeah. Like that. Because that's too small a size to see a good picture. So I had to make it so they expanded.
That's great, Laurie. And yep. So a question from Hannah. Do you know who cared for the boys while they were up there?
I don't know. I'm wondering if my cousin Peter knows, because he knows a lot more of the family history. But I know they often stayed with friends in Jackson.
That sounds right. Oh, question from Kim. Are all 25 copies spoken for?
Yes, they are. Well, actually, I have one copy that it was kind of like my first bound one. It was like my test run. So I saved that because I didn't want to sell it, because I didn't think it was as good quality as the others. But I do have one more, so I own 2 copies. This is my better copy.
Well, when the museum reopens, we do have a copy in our collection. So if people want to come see it in person, they're welcome to come by the museum and see it. I will have to grab it from our archives and have it available so that people can see it.
Thank you.
Question from Kate. If you could ask all your questions of your grandmother, what would they be? So to your grandmother.
Oh, Yeah, what did it, well, I mean, obviously I was concerned about what did it feel like to have to hike in all those clothes. And I know Becky Fullerton actually did an adventure of her own, but I think the clothing that she chose to hike in, the era of clothing was a little bit later than my grandmother because her skirt was not as long. I think she wore knickers too. So yeah, I mean, I would have loved to have known a lot of things like that, very personal things. I mean, how did they maintain their courage, and how did they stay warm? I just felt like there was no way that they could communicate with the outside world, and they didn't know how long the storm would last, and there was no way to know those things, so they just had to stick it out.
That's great. Kind of leading into that, our next question, will you talk a little bit more about women's challenges hiking?
Yeah, I think that it was probably, women probably had to most likely go with male companions, that it didn't feel safe for women to go alone. But I did read a little bit of a diary that Becky found for me about a woman who used to come every summer from Germany, and she would spend the whole summer camping out in the mountains. And she was the one that carried her food in her bedroll in her pulled up skirt. And I don't know how she did it. I would love to read more of those diaries because I think they really reveal an awful lot. Back then, it was called tramping. It was not seen as hiking the way we think of it in terms of having all the right gear and being totally prepared for any emergency. And so it was more seen as recreational. And so, their whole approach to it was of that nature, that this is going to be fun. It's, and, but I think that, it also speaks to the fact that women can do anything men can do. And that nothing daunted those women who enjoyed being outdoors. And so, yeah.
That's wonderful. Another question. Did your grandmother hike the same trail ever again?
I do not know. That's another question I would have asked her. I have hiked the same route that they would have hiked, and that stretch that they would have hiked on day 2, if they had waited any longer, or if they had headed out earlier before the storm really hit, they would have been stuck on such barren, exposed terrain. They would have died. They would not have made it. It's a hard hike, that distance between both huts.
I can't imagine.
Yeah.
What were the most challenging and the most joyful parts of creating the book?
Oh, challenging, I think, again, I had to learn how to use InDesign, which I only barely knew how to use. And some of the details of printing on the letterpress, I had done printing before, but I had never mixed Pantone colors by weighing the colors and then mixing them together. I spent a lot of the time by myself in that studio doing the printing, and they had lights on a motion sensor in the studio, and so every now and then, even just walking back and forth running each print was not enough motion to make those lights stay on, and so every now and then I'd have to go run around the studio to get the lights to turn back on. Things like that. A lot of new skills, and being in the studio by yourself days and days in it. Yeah, it was challenging, but the joy, so many joys, because everything that turned out okay, it was like, wow, how did this happen? It was just very exciting to just see each step of the process take shape. And I had some wonderful people who encouraged me and helped me with a few little details or taught me things. And so that was fun too.
Great. Let's see, got some great questions here. I guess as a follow-up to when you were talking about how you had done the hike too. Have you done hikes since you finished the book, or do you have any other plans to retrace footprints and do the hike again yourself, knowing what you do now?
That's a good question. Actually, I had hoped that before I started my sabbatical year, I had hoped that I would be able to do that hike again and take my own photographs along the way and use those. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. And so, no, I have not since done that hike. I would love to. It's an amazing hike. And sure, why not?
Let's see. When your grandparents got off the mountain after the storm, were they dehydrated when they were rescued?
Oh, that I have no answer for. I imagine they probably were.
So
The thing about my grandfather's story was that he glossed over all kinds of details, like, okay, was there an outhouse? What did they do about, if the water got sucked out of their buckets when they tried to gather it from the stream, then how did they get water? And all of those things. And I read also in his account that one of the hikers was wearing canvas shoes. So, there's just so many things I wish I knew more about, but.
yeah, the practical info.
Yeah.
That goes perfectly to this next question. Was there any description of the others that they were snowbound with?
A little bit, especially at the beginning when they were talking about the beginning of their hike, as they started out with excitement and all of that. And so there was a little bit of an introduction to the other folks. And I think one was Lucia's brother. I'd have to look it back up again, but others were friends too. So there were 2 women in that hike.
Do you know why the stove provided so little heat, even though they had plenty of fuel?
Well, if you think about the fact that the building was built of stone, and if winds were at 175 miles per hour and it was snowing, it had to have been awfully cold outside, and those stones would radiate cold or would absorb cold. I think the interior walls, there was some wood siding perhaps on them, and those windows, those 8-foot windows, yeah, I think it would take a lot of a little tiny pot-bellied stove to heat that space.
Not much insulation, right?
Right.
Question from Hannah. Is this a well-known story? How has it affected the greater history of the AMC?
Oh, wow. I don't know if it's a well-known story. It was published in Appalachia Magazine. Maybe at the time it was well-known, but yeah, I only heard about it, when I was old enough to really think about those things. And so I don't know if it's known. When I worked with Becky Fullerton, that kind of opened things up a little. And now that they have a copy of my book too, it's possible people will discover it, but yeah, I don't think so.
All right, let's see. Oh. Yep, great comment from Becky. It would be wonderful if AMC did an article on how you translated the story.
Oh, thank you, Becky.
Well known.
Thank you.
Let's see. It looks like that is it for questions for right now. People might be typing. Oh, here we go. Had your grandparents done many hikes before this hike, and did they do a lot of hiking after?
Definitely yes. Yeah. Yeah, they love the White Mountains.
Where did they live? Where were they from?
They lived in Newton, Massachusetts.
Okay.
Newtonville, I think. Yeah.
Not that far away. Okay, question from Jeff. Will you be doing a book tour, Laurie?
No. Sorry, Jeff. That's very sweet.
All right. Interesting comment about, yep, it's very interesting to think about the weather forecasting at that time. Imagine it's pretty non-existent.
Yeah, that and the fact that all they had to rely on up there for communication was telegraph, and and that wasn't functioning. And, you know, so many things that we take for granted. I think about that picture of the buggy with the horse-drawn buggy on the carriage road, and think about, you know, every supply had to be taken up that way. And even today, I know some things are helicoptered to the summit of Mount Washington in some of the huts in the White Mountains, but for the most part, they're carried on the back of the hut crews. And so still old-fashioned ways to get the goods up there to take care of people.
That's great. From Nancy, is your copy going to be the family icon copy of your book?
I don't know. Each of my kids, Ben and Bethany, have a copy, and my sister has a copy. And so I don't know what will happen to this one. They can decide one day.
Some really nice comments. Thank you for sharing this very touching story of your family. So rewarding. You could reproduce it in such a fashion.
Thank you.
And let's see. Question from Jeff. How did these people become interested in tramping?
I don't know. I don't really know. Yeah. Maybe my cousin Peter will know more about that. These are good questions. And it's, you know, it makes you realize how much you need to ask your grandparents questions before you lose your chance to ask them. Unfortunately, that's sort of the way life is. That's what happens to us.
So true. All right. Comment from Mary Parker. Thank you for doing this, Laurie. I wish I'd asked my father more questions about this before he died.
So Mary and Peter are the children of my father's oldest brother, David, who was the 8-year-old who possibly realized what was going on with his parents. Yeah.
I would think that would be very scary for him to have his.
I would think so too. I would think so. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Well, that is it for questions right now, unless people are typing.
It's just such a great story, Laurie, and I love how the story is also, you know, becomes a shared kind of history. And I think that the questions about how this might have impacted AMC or impacted hiking in general, you know, are good questions, because that's how those kinds of things happen, right?
Right. Well, yeah. It's often from tragedies or near tragedies that we learn the things we need to do to prevent them.
Yeah. Yeah. There's more questions coming in, Rebecca?
Some wonderful comments from your friends. When you come see us in Michigan, please bring the book.
Be careful, Laurie. That might become the.
So answer, I don't know who this is from, but in asking about the family hiking after this adventure, their son Duncan climbed Mount Washington at age 5.
Oh, that's my sister.
Okay.
That's my sister, Julie. Hi, Julie. I didn't remember that. That's so awesome. Yeah. Well, they started him young. Yeah. And I took Bethany and Ben up in some of the mountains, not on Washington, but in some of the mountains when they were little kids. And, you know, eventually it got into their blood too.
Well, I want to thank everyone for being here this evening, and thank you, Laurie, so very much for giving your time and sharing this wonderful project with us. What a great experience.
Thank you so much. It means so much to me. And as I said, this has been a blessing that keeps on blessing. It was an amazing experience, and I'm just tickled to be able to share it with more people, because it was a special story. But thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for coming this evening. Thank you, Laurie.
Thank you. Thank you.
Applause.
Thank you.
That's wonderful. Thank you for coming. Keep watching the museums. If you're not getting our emails, you can sign up to get them and know when our next talks will be. But thank you for coming this evening.
Thank you.